Our panel tonight is entitled Foreign Policy 1996. Mr. Sterne will introduce the panel. Let me just remind you of Mr. Sterne and his background. As you know, he's been with the Sun since 1953. He's been editor of the editorial page since 1972. His service early with the Sun was in London and Bonn and in Washington, as well as assignments here in Baltimore. All of us are very proud and have been for a long time of Baltimore's paper, and especially the thoroughness and solid quality of the editorial page. Mr. Sterne has been good enough to chair this panel for now the 16th time. It's my great pleasure to introduce Joseph R.L. Sterne.
As always, this is a highlight of my year, and highlighted for my newspaper to have such an interested and well-advised audience on foreign policy. I have to start out tonight by bringing you greetings from Charlie Caudry. He's a little wobbly on his legs, he tells me, and he can't make it, and he wants you to know that his 15 years in this panel was one of the nicest things that ever happened to me in journalism. I'm quoting him. It's really been a terrific experience dealing with an audience that is so interested, so knowledgeable, and so wrapped up in foreign policy issues. So I promised Charlie I would convey his greetings to all of you. He has always been one of the real stars of the Baltimore Sun, and we've admired him for many, many years. We have a special added attraction. You can take that word both ways. Tonight, Ginger Thompson, a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, is going to join our panel for one very important reason. After joining the Sun several years ago, starting out as a night police reporter, working her way up through the local newsroom, and working on some wonderful welfare stories and other stories, she was assigned to the Mexico Bureau of the Sun. And there she covered some of the major stories in Latin America, but most particularly she and one of her colleagues were assigned over a long period of time, well over a year of complete concentration on the situation that existed in Honduras in the 80s. This was completely ignored to a great extent in the American press because most of our interest was focused on El Salvador and Nicaragua. But through her investigative work, she produced a series of articles that I think she'll tell you has goaded the United States government into some kind of action. So Ginger, why don't you start off telling us about your Honduras?
Thank you, Joe. First, I'd like to thank the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for inviting me here tonight. I'm truly honored. I'd like to tell you about Jose Barrera, a former assassin in the battalion known as 316, a CIA-trained Honduran military unit. I first met Jose Barrera in a dimly lit apartment in Toronto 2 years ago. And my colleague, as Joe mentioned, Gary Cohn, and I went to interview him about his activities with Battalion 316. He looked just as I had imagined he would look. He was very slim, had very dark eyes, a very distant stare. He even had a gold front tooth. But what I was shocked by was his coldness. And he spoke about stabbing people to death and torturing people as if they were scenes that he had watched on television. He downed double shots of Sambuca, and he described the prisons in which Battalion 316 held their victims, and he said, and I'm quoting, "We kept them in their own excrement, and when they were very weak, we would take them to disappear." During the 1980s, more than 180 people disappeared in Honduras at the hands of Battalion 316. They were kept naked in secret jails, interrogated, and when they were no longer useful, they were executed. And their bodies were taken and dumped along dirt roads or two-lane highways like garbage. Hundreds of other people were stalked, kidnapped, tortured, and released alive. For 14 months, Gary Cohn and I traveled to Central America, Canada, and the United States to trace the activities of this battalion and its relationship with the United States. It was an effort unique to newspapers, which normally devote such energy to investigating current events rather than events of the past. Even during the height of Battalion 316's violence, as Joe has already mentioned, very few people paid attention. The eyes of the media were trained on the wars being fought in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Honduras, however, was the staging ground for U.S. efforts in the region. And one of the United States' tools for wiping out communism in Honduras was Battalion 316. For us, however, it was important that this be a story more than a tale of an evil U.S. foreign policy. What we wanted to write was a murder story, a story about how decisions made in Washington destroy the lives of people thousands of miles away. To get this story, we knew we had to pursue several key elements. One was interviews with men who served in this battalion. And living in Canada, we found 4 of them who had fled Honduras in the late 1980s and were living in exile. We spoke to each of them at length and on the record, and we were able to photograph 3 of them. They all spoke about torture and murder with the same coldness and the same distance as Jose Barrera. For example, Florencio Caballero, who is a torturer in the battalion, talked about the captivity of a woman named Inés Murillo, describing how she was hung from a ceiling and beaten like a punching bag at the same time that he gulped shrimp and Budweiser. He said when we asked him why he did what he did, he didn't say that he was devoted to saving his country from communism. He said he did it for the money. If someone comes and offers you a very high salary, he said, of course you're going to accept. Another important element for our story was interviews with the victims who survived. We spoke, for example, with Inés Murillo at length. She talked to us about her 78 days in the secret jails of Battalion 316 and about the torture that she endured. We asked her about the electric shock that she suffered, and she told us how wires were clipped to her breasts and she was shocked repeatedly for hours. She said, it was frightening the way my body would shake when they shocked me. They stuffed rags in my throat so that I would not scream, but I screamed so loud I sounded like an animal. We also interviewed relatives of the disappeared, women who have searched desperately for their missing loved ones for the last 12 years and who have once a month continued to hold vigils in front of the Honduran Congress to demand that the government investigate the fate of their loved ones. And we interviewed numerous U.S. diplomats who were stationed in Honduras at the time, and we won the declassification of U.S. documents. Through those sources, we learned that the U.S. government collaborated with Battalion 316 by providing its members with training and providing funds to the Honduran military. We learned that in order to keep money flowing to Honduras for the Reagan administration's campaign against communism, that the administration made numerous misleading statements that either denied or minimized the violence of Battalion 316. The stories, since their publication, have had powerful impact in both Washington and Honduras. The Senate has passed an amendment in September calling for the Clinton administration to expedite the declassification of all documents relating to Battalion 316. President Clinton has agreed to make the declassification a priority, and in the spring, the State Department tells us that they will release some 7,000 documents to Honduran authorities. the CIA has launched an internal investigation into its relationship with Battalion 316, and the CIA chief, John Deutsch, has already said that the investigation into the agency's activities in Honduras would provide a lesson of how not to do things. In Honduras, the Attorney General's office has filed for the first time ever charges against former members of Battalion 316. Charges have been filed against 9 current and former officers for the kidnapping and torture of 6 university students in 1982. And murder charges have been filed against 2 officers in the disappearance of Nelson McKay. He was a government lawyer and suspected subversive who disappeared in 1982, and his remains were found in December of 1994. One of the ways that he was identified was the shirt that he wore when his wife last saw him still covered his skeleton. The Honduran military has tried to stop these trials by arguing that a 1991 amnesty covered their crimes. But in an historic decision made 2 weeks ago by the Honduran Supreme Court, the court ordered lower courts to go forward with those trials. It was the first step toward true law and order in that country, and the first sign that the military's long enjoyed immunity is coming to an end. For the relatives of those who disappeared, it was a very significant triumph, and for the first time 2 weeks ago, they gathered to celebrate rather than to protest. And I was fortunate enough to be there, and I stood against a wall watching these grandmothers twirling their granddaughters on the dance floor. And another journalist walked over to me, and I'd like to, in closing, share his comment because I think it expresses the renewed hope of people in Honduras. He said to me, "Ginger, I feel like I just want to live forever on this tiny piece of land called Honduras." Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. I think we know at our paper, and I think a lot of other people know, that the United States government would not be taking notice but for the series that she worked on for so long. Our next speaker is Mark Matthews. He needs no introduction to this audience. He's become an old-timer on this panel. He's the diplomatic correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, and Mark is going to give his estimate of what we can expect this year in foreign policy.
Thank you, Joe. Ginger's and Gary's series opened a window on the excesses of the Cold War, and what I'm going to touch on this afternoon are some of the differences between that period and the current one that we're living through, and some of the difficulties that the United States is still having making the adjustment to what is no longer a new era. Nothing illustrates the contrast more between the early 80s and right now than the realization that this year an American election has to compete in importance with elections overseas. This year there will be presidential elections in Taiwan and Russia. Palestinians just recently elected both a chairman and a legislature, and Israel holds a crucially important election probably in May, or if not then this coming fall. A few years ago, few people could have imagined that Bill Clinton would have any foreign policy achievements worth campaigning on. But in fact, he does, because over the past year, we've seen some displays of skill that have boosted the president's world stature and really elevated American foreign policy far above what people expected of President Clinton. In the past year, he and his administration really seemed to have reached a kind of post-Cold War cruising speed. Their biggest achievement was in hammering out a settlement in the war in Bosnia. This was a war that had plagued 2 administrations and provided almost a constant horrible accusation of incompetence and or callousness. It almost became kind of a metaphor for Clinton foreign policy. that last summer, with a combination of heavy airstrikes and some determined diplomacy, chiefly by Richard Holbrooke, the United States knocked heads together on the ground and got a deal. This deal, this settlement, is probably unjust. It partitions a sovereign country and fails to ensure that the worst criminals will be captured. And it may not produce a lasting peace, but it certainly beats the alternative, which was continued warfare and atrocities. The administration will tell you that they saw an opportunity, that the Bosnian Serbs were weakening, that Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian president, was anxious to get sanctions lifted, and they moved in to seize it. Cynics will tell you that President Clinton looked into the abyss of trying to extricate United Nations peacekeepers in a hostile environment and decided that going for a peace settlement was the lesser of two evils. I think both things were at play, as well as the determination of Richard Holbrooke. This settlement taught the administration, and I think taught most of us who have been watching foreign policy in Washington, a powerful lesson. That if the United States doesn't do it, if the United States doesn't take the initiative to lead, it just won't get done. Without the United States acting as the driving force, both the UN and NATO would be fairly ineffective actors, probably just debating societies. By now, something of a national consensus seems to have formed around this idea. You hear the term American leadership uttered very, very frequently, and also quite often on the campaign trail. But when it comes to backing this idea up with money, the money seems to be available only for military activities. Indeed, the United States is reducing its diplomatic clout around the world, closing missions, and more importantly, withdrawing investments that are so important to future stability in the world. Already, even before the Republicans captured Congress in 1994, the United States was right at the bottom of the world's list of donor countries as a proportion of gross national product. That figure has slipped still further, and what I'm afraid we're going to see in the developing world, and certainly Ginger can describe conditions in Honduras, is that the effort to build economies, to build industries, to develop trade, to develop institutions is slipping, and the possible consequences over the long term are more ethnic conflict, such as we've seen in Rwanda and Burundi, where people living on per capita income of $300 a year are slaughtering one another for ethnic reasons, but also to eke out a living. There's too many people on too little space. It's quite possible we're going to see this not only in Africa, but elsewhere in the developing world. During the Cold War, we had a reason to invest. We were buying cooperation around the world. Now the United States is so strapped for cash when it comes to foreign aid that we have to depend heavily on Europe to carry out the reconstruction of Bosnia. This reconstruction is vitally important because unless the three populations involved, the Muslims, the Serbs, and the Croats, see clear signs that things are going to get better, they will have little incentive not to resume fighting after NATO troops leave. There's another lesson that perhaps our government hasn't learned well enough, and that is the need for constant high-level attention to certain serious problems, and not just when those problems are at the top of the news. North Korea will continue to be a test for this administration. Even though the United States has coordinated a multi-billion-dollar program to provide North Korea with safe nuclear reactors, Pyongyang continues its gradual military buildup along the border with South Korea in pursuit of its ultimate dream, which is the unification of the Korean Peninsula by force. The way the Clinton administration handled North Korea can't have been ignored by China, which is rapidly becoming the #1 concern not just of Washington, but of America's allies in the Pacific. Increasingly, over the past year, China has made menacing noises and gestures in the direction of Taiwan, and the administration's response has been difficult to figure out. Calculated ambiguity is one thing, but in this case, it seems to be a question of the administration not really being fully in charge of its policy. Last year, a decision was made that President Lee Teng-hui of Taiwan would not be allowed into the United States, but after both houses of Congress overwhelmingly passed a resolution demanding that he be admitted to this country, the administration flip-flopped and allowed him in to speak at his alma mater at Cornell. Regardless of the merits of that decision, the way it was handled was a very damaging precedent for American credibility in the Pacific. We saw earlier in the case of China and its human rights policies how the administration was willing to pull back on an issue of principle and agree that human rights would no longer be a factor in our trade relations with China. What seems to be lacking in the administration's response to various provocations from China is a competent and firm effort to reduce tensions. But it's almost hard to imagine how such an effort could be carried out successfully given the fact that China's own leadership is right now in a state of flux. In June, the Russian people will pick their next president. The fact that this will happen at all is a measure of just how far we've come from the Cold War. Russia no longer suppresses political action or free speech. But what the Russian candidates say and do also gives the lie to the notion that democracies can't cause real problems for one another. Indeed, the more Russian politicians appeal to the needs and desires of their constituents, the more they veer from the kind of Russia that we want to see. They appeal to fear and anger over the expansion of NATO. They appeal to nostalgia for state-owned enterprises that guaranteed everybody a low-paying job whether they actually worked or not. And they appeal to a desire somehow to restore a Soviet empire. Not to mention that Yeltsin jeopardizes the reform process and help from the IMF by spending money his government doesn't have. American officials cautiously predict that Yeltsin is the man to beat in the Russian elections. That's because I think the alternate choices are a little too dreadful for Washington to accept, one being an ardent, fierce nationalist, and the other a return of the Communist Party. But we can't be sure that Moscow, even if Yeltsin is reelected, will stay on the reform path. Another election that will be pivotal is going to occur in Israel either in late spring or, if the reports out of Israel today are incorrect, certainly by the end of October. It could play havoc with the Middle East peace process. Secretary Christopher met today with Prime Minister Peres, and they both came out and announced that even if Mr. Peres calls early elections, the negotiations between Israel and Syria will move forward. But it's hard to see Peres being in a position to make substantial concessions, basically a firm pledge to withdraw from the Golan Heights until the election is over. And without such a pledge, no one believes Syrian President Hafez Assad is prepared to make peace. It would be great for us as Marylanders to speak of the atmosphere created by the talks at the Y conference centers on the Eastern Shore, but unfortunately that atmosphere has yet to be translated into concessions, serious concessions on either side that would pave the way for peace. Thank you very much.
In introducing our next speaker, I'd like to mention that the press room in the Pentagon is called the Mark S. Watson Room. It's called that because in honor of a great defense correspondent for the Baltimore Sun. General Watson covered World War II and after World War II for our newspaper. He was succeeded by Charlie Caudry, person you all know, and now we have a very worthy successor in what I think is a great Baltimore Sun tradition of military coverage, and this is Gilbert Lewthwaite. Gilbert is really one of our most experienced correspondents. He's been based in Moscow, Rome, Paris, and London. He's covered revolutions in Europe, the Middle East, the Far East, and Central America. He's covered the Kremlin, the White House, and the Vatican, not to mention Downing Street and the Elysee Palace. I think he ought to tell us now whether the Pentagon beats them all. Gilbert?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for the invitation. First of all, some very nice things have quite properly been said about Charlie, and I'd like to join in simply by paraphrasing another debater in another forum and say that I know Charlie Caudry and I'm no Charlie Caudry. But that said, I would just like to try and tell you where I see the defense debate at this point. These are busy times in the defense world. The fight over defense priorities, the questioning of national defense strategy, the shifting pattern of defense alliances, and the changing styles of military interventions. All these are bringing changes and challenge to the Pentagon. And perhaps the handiest guidepost to the defense debate that we will all be having this year during the election is the fiscal 96 defense budget. The budget, as you probably know, passed last month after much controversy and an initial presidential veto. It comes in at $265 billion, which is $7 billion more than the Pentagon says it either wants or needs. But that goes to the very heart of the debate, which is this country adequately defended? The answer, of course, tends to follow partisan lines, with the Republicans saying the defense cuts have gone too deep and the United States is now vulnerable. The Democrats, on the other hand, believe that in the post-Cold War era, America still has enough military might to defend its interests both at home and abroad. One part of the budget provides a particular insight into the conflicting perspectives, and that is missile defense. It is one of the issues that provoked the presidential veto. Originally, the Republicans wanted to have a missile defense system for the nation deployed by the year 2003. Those Republicans, like Floyd Spence, the chairman of the House National Security Committee, see this issue as the great sleeper issue of the election. They believe that once the voters wake up to the notion or the reality that this country has no effective missile defense at this point, it will become a hot-button issue. A recent poll by the Program of the International Policy, by the Program on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland suggests they may be right. It found that 90% of those questioned were concerned about the threat from rogue states such as Iran, Libya, and North Korea. Proponents of missile defense point to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missile technology among such countries. Just in recent days, there have been reports of new missile tests by both China and Iran. Also, of course, there are the thousands of missiles which are still in Russian hands. These will be roughly halved under the SALT II treaty, which was ratified by the Senate last month, but there will still be an awesome number left, probably in the region of 3,500. All this convinces proponents that this country should quickly deploy a defensive system against missiles as soon as possible. The administration counters with its own argument that while the threat exists, it is not here and now. So spending billions of dollars on deploying a system at this point is not justified. The administration also argues that the missile defense system would be a breach of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and could jeopardize the Soviet ratification of SALT II. Rather, the administration favors the lower cost option of developing the technology for the system but not deploying it until the threat is deemed to be real. In the administration's mind, that might be in 10 or 15 years. And by the best estimate, it would take probably about 6 years to develop and deploy a national missile defense system. Faced with President Clinton's veto, the Republicans dropped the missile defense deployment deadline from the budget, but they made it clear the battle is not over. They will prepare freestanding legislation and hold hearings, all to try to alert the public to what they perceive as a real and present threat. In the meantime, both sides agree on missile defense, that the top priority should be for the troops in the battlefield, otherwise known as theater missile defense. And that is, there is little argument about that. The argument there tends to be between the services over which system would be the best. Another example in the budget of these conflicting views, which will be aired in the election, is the B-2. Sorry. Here, the Republicans want to build 20 more of the stealth bombers. The Democrats say that the 20 we already have are sufficient for the job. No one disputes that the plane is, in fact, an excellent weapons system, but the question is it needed in the post-Cold War era? It was designed specifically to penetrate Soviet airspace, to evade radar, and to deliver a death blow to that nation's ability to conduct a war. Now the question is, should a plane that costs $1.5 billion be put at risk on some lesser mission which could be possibly as well done by another and much cheaper system, a plane or missile? The answer to that question from Secretary William Perry, the Defense Secretary, and from the Pentagon is no. They love the plane, but say they simply cannot afford it. Faced with such opposition again, the Republicans scale back their B-2 ambitions, but the budget still contains almost $500 million as seed money for the eventual development of those 20 other B-2s. So here again, the issue is still very much on the table. The core question of whether this nation is capable of defending itself is particularly valid in the wake of 4 years of military drawdown. The active duty force level has been reduced by about 1/3 to 1.5 million men and women. The Navy, as an example, in the 1980s had its eyes set on a 600-ship fleet. It is now slightly more than half that number. The Army, instead of buying new battle tanks, is now upgrading its old tanks. The only reason the new tank production lines are open is to fill foreign orders. Maintaining the short-term readiness has taken priority, in fact, over weapons acquisition and modernization. The acquisition of new weapons has been delayed so that the scarce money can be used for the operations and maintenance budgets of the forces in the field, so they can be ready to fight a war with the weapons they have. Defense Secretary Perry's thoughts on this is that since the forces have shrunk, they have been able to get rid of their older weapons and keep only their newer ones. And this has given the administration a window of opportunity or a breathing space to step back from acquisition. But this is only temporary relief. And Mr. Perry has recently been expressing increasing concern over the impact on the long-term readiness of the troops, whether these weapons will in fact be available and affordable when they are needed. The administration blueprint calls for the modernization to start in a couple of years. But this depends on billions of dollars being saved from the current round of base closings. It depends on the Pentagon business reforms yielding great savings, and it also depends on Congress passing the authorizations for future spending which the administration will seek. With so many imponderables, Mr. Perry is probably right to be having second thoughts. Nevertheless, the contention inside the Pentagon is that the United States has the leanest, most efficient fighting force it has ever fielded, and it is quite capable of doing the job expected of it. That, of course, is to fight two almost simultaneous regional conflicts as the basic planning element for the force levels. While planning for the big one, or one should say the big two under the current schedule, defense planners are also having to cope with the what they like to call situations other than war, the Bosnias, the Somalias, the Haitis of the world. These present their own challenges. Frequently these days, the warrior soldier must become the soldier diplomat or the soldier policeman. The soldier, trained to kick down the door and kill those inside, suddenly finds himself having to knock to ask for entry and protect the civil rights of those he finds there. It's not a role they were initially trained for, but it is a role to which they are adapting. And to their credit, they seem to be doing a fine job of it. These contingency operations themselves are constantly changing. Take Bosnia as an example. For the first time, you have Russian troops serving under American command. The Germans have sent 4,000 ground troops out of their own territory for their first mission since World War II, and the French have rejoined the unified command of NATO for the first time since the 1960s. These are all significant changes which point the way for wider military cooperation in the future. And this is a development the voters want. The poll I mentioned earlier finds that 2/3 favored more involvement in international missions by by Russia, Germany, and Japan. Burden sharing, in fact, is a popular concept. And waiting in the wings to join the alliance are several East European nations, former members of the old Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. One of the reasons Hungary was so anxious to lend its territory as a conduit for the American troops into Bosnia was to show its mettle as a potential NATO partner. Almost all the 20,000 American troops slated for Bosnia are now there, and they seem to be doing the job well. Compliance by the belligerents with the military terms of the Dayton Accord is rated by the commanders at more than 90%. The warring factions have withdrawn from the zones of separation and have removed their heavy weapons. The NATO troops are now destroying the bunkers and any ammunition they find. The big danger, as everyone anticipated, is the mines, 6 million of them. No fewer than 7,000 minefields have already been marked, but that is thought to be only about half of those actually sown. 9 soldiers have died and 44 have been injured, mainly due to mines since the NATO troops started arriving in December. There is also the potential danger of the Islamic fundamentalist extremists who have merged with who were fighting for the Serbs and who have merged with the population. And of course, there's the occasional sniper fire. But basically, what Mr. Perry termed the toughest, meanest dog on the block has the situation under control, at least for the moment. Peacekeeping is not a cheap operation. The estimated cost for Bosnia is 1.5 billion this year, or for the year-long operation. The Pentagon would like to set up a contingency fund to pay for such operations, but Congress suspects that it sees a slush fund in the making and is resisting. This means that the Pentagon has to go to the Congress, has to find the money initially out of its operating and maintenance funds, and then go to Congress to ask for repayment. And this delay can impact on the training and readiness of the troops. We saw that about a year ago, or no, maybe 18 months ago, when there was a lot of concern that previous contingency plans was hampering readiness. The signs were basically warning signs, a reduction in training, a lack of live fire exercises, and various signals like that. These were quickly spotted and corrected, but it just does show how overdrawn and tightly drawn is the reduced military. Defense today is at a crossroads. The drawdown is all but finished, and the modernization of the weaponry, which has been delayed, is about to start. Many of the weapons are already in the development stage, and there is no lack of vision in the Pentagon. There is talk even now of a massive arsenal ship which can fire hundreds of missiles, which will be stationed in mid-ocean and launch its fusillade from there. There is the talk of a fighter that can go 12 times the speed of sound, and of a battlefield in which victory can be achieved totally by non-lethal means. All these are on the drawing board, and I suspect that the election in November will have some influence on how fast and how far and how much we spend on getting there. Thank you very much.
When we gather here again next year, we could have a Likud president of Israel pledged against the peace process. We could have a communist in power in the Kremlin, dismantling what passes for democracy in that country. And we could even have a Republican in the White House. I would like to concentrate a little bit on the Republicans, because the party of the outs always has the luxury of going through a great inward searching of its fundamentals and of its philosophy, much more so than the party in power, because there the president is such a dominant figure that we forget, for example, how strong the protectionist element is in the left wing of the Democratic Party. So let's talk a little bit about the Republican Party in terms of what this election means for foreign policy. The latest polls out of New Hampshire give us Forbes 26, Dole 22, Buchanan 13, Alexander 13, Graham 4, and Graham 5, and poor old Lugar 4. Now, Senator Lugar is the one candidate who has really schooled himself in foreign policy. He has been a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's dealt with world leaders. He has acquaintances almost in every important government in the world. And it's a kind of a commentary on politics in America today that the outstanding foreign policy candidate of the Republican Party is in single digits. And there he probably will remain. So let's talk a little bit about what the other candidates stand for. We have in the Republican lineup Pat Buchanan. Now, he is a very interesting political figure because he stands for absolute protectionism, going back probably to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, if this is not high enough for him. He also is an America firster. He's against all trade pacts. He would like to pull out of Bosnia. He would like to keep us out of these third world encounters that have plagued the Clinton administration. And of course, he stands for a fortress America. He would be quite willing to finance the missile defense system that Gilbert Lewthwaite described so well. He would like to build up our forces. And this is really something that must sound a little bit weird to people when we think of what the Republican Party has come to stand for. Yes, the Republican Party was the party of protectionism in the 30s. Yes, it was the party of isolationism in the 30s. But through World War II and then the emergence of Arthur Vandenberg in the Republican Party, you had an internationalist element in the party that has prevailed to this day. President Reagan, for example, was an all-out free trader. He was the president who looked forward to the day when all agricultural subsidies in all nations would be eliminated. George Bush was the president who negotiated the guts of what became the NAFTA treaty, and he was very important in giving its support. You have also in the Republican Party a group of fervent internationalists, even more so than the Democratic Party in terms of presidential power. You'll recall that the War Powers Resolution was passed about 1972, primarily by Democrats in reaction to the Vietnam War. Every president since that time has correctly ruled that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional and has ignored it, every single one of them, including the present one. And we had the spectacle here of the Republicans trying to deal with the Bosnian situation, and what they did finally was to beg the president to act unilaterally to send troops into Bosnia because they did not want to take on the onus of advocating this policy themselves. This is institutional more than political. Congress just can't run foreign policy. So where is the burden, where is the weight of the party now? I think it still remains internationalist. I think that if Forbes or Dole or Alexander or Lugar were to be elected president, they would carry on in the traditions of Vandenberg and Eisenhower and Nixon and Reagan. Graham is another matter. He is a free trader, but on the other hand, I think he's very much in the Fortress America category. So I just want to say that foreign policy is not going to make a big splash in this election unless we have a communist come to power in Kremlin, unless we have a war breakout in the Taiwan Straits. And just would like to remind everybody of something I mentioned to my colleague before we came on here. 40 years ago, in the 1956 election, everything came down to the final week. The final week brought us Suez. It brought us the Soviet invasion of Hungary. And it certainly stirred up political rumpus in this country that did not change the final outcome of the election, but it showed that foreign policy, as much as a lot of Americans would like to ignore it, it just can't be ignored. Thank you.
I'm slow getting up here because I was still taking notes. Those were extraordinary presentations. We thank the panel very, very much for them. Our session this evening will go until 20 after 7. First question.
Mr. Sterne, I'd like to pose a debating point for you and let you take a crack at it. I propose that the print media is irrelevant to foreign policy and that it is dominated by the video media. According to Mr. Matthews, he says issues such as China, Taiwan, North Korea, and so forth pose deep threats that the administration has not addressed. Yet you look at Bosnia, you look at Somalia, even Honduras. Once you get pictures in there, once you get the video media involved, now the administration responds. How do you propose to change that, or am I right? Is the print media irrelevant to foreign policies?
I think my colleagues would like to get into this too. I would say that the print media is not irrelevant. It's certainly less important than it was before the advent of television, because you're absolutely right. Where the cameras go, that's where public opinion focuses. There are a lot of people being killed in the southern Sudan, but nobody gives a damn because the cameras aren't there. On the contrary, there were cameras in Somalia, so we went into Somalia. However, we like to think in the print media that before the television fellas get themselves all prettied up and start speaking to the cameras, that they learn the guts of what's happening in the world, and they learn the details and the analysis and the contextualization from the print media. But go ahead, Gilbert, you do it.
Well, I'd just like to endorse what Joe said. I think what the television does, it gives the public the awareness of a situation, and very frequently, as in the case of starvation in Africa, it is the flag that draws the attention. But I think at the bottom line, once you're aware of it, if you want to understand it, you're still well advised to read the serious print journalists. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Park.
My name is Kenneth Wu. I'm an avid fan of Baltimore Sun with a bias. My brother Eddie Wu used to work for the Hong Kong Bureau, and he retired. I have a question in 3 parts. One is that, what is the commitment of the Baltimore Sun under the new management to cover foreign affairs, particularly China, Burma, India? I'm a CBI veteran. China, the largest totalitarian government in Asia, India, the largest democracy, and Burma, an orphan of the British Empire. So question 1. And question 2 is that recently, about 3 months ago, the CIA director said at the National Press Club that CIA should start using journalists and clergymen as cover. And this is to lift the ban, that came about in the 70s. And last week, a non-government task force recommended the same thing. If I were a journalist or clergy, the marrows in my bone would chill and freeze, lower than the temperature outside the building. I'd like to have your comments on that.
So far as the commitment of the Baltimore Sun to foreign coverage, I'd like to say this. Like a lot of other newspapers, we're under a lot of cost constraints. The cost of newsprint has doubled in the past year, and we all are going through what is some painful buyouts and downsizing that's going right across the board in American industry. If you go through if you stick strictly to finger counting on numbers of bureaus for American press overseas, you'll find it is contracting somewhat. On the other hand, there's some people in the news business who think rather than incurring a lot of fixed costs in a lot of foreign bureaus, you might be better off to invest your money into special investigations that the wire services or networks like the New York Times are not covering. And I would say that in judging the Baltimore Sun on its performance in the past year or two, you have to look at the story that Ginger Thompson pulled together on Honduras. No other newspaper did this. 2 reporters were assigned full-time for 14 months, which is practically unheard of. You also had an extraordinary series on the NSA in my newspaper. This produced more information on the NSA, which happens to be one of the biggest businesses in Maryland that has ever been printed anywhere in any medium. So I would say that we have to be agile, we have to be realistic, but I think that the commitment of the newspaper to covering the world is as strong as ever.
Could I just make a point on that? The Baltimore Sun, in fact, in the world, is a unique institution. There is no other paper with a circulation of 250,000 daily and a general readership that spends as much, that has, at the moment we have, I think, 8 foreign bureaus. It may come down a little, but still it would leave us in a unique situation. There is no paper of the size of the Baltimore Sun anywhere in the world that's a general readership paper that makes such an investment in independent news gathering. And I think that will continue even under the restrictions.
Could you comment on my second question? How do you all feel about CIA, officially and non-officially, saying that journalists and clergy should be used as cover, as intelligence agents?
I haven't heard the CIA say that. Have they actually said that they're going to? Are they going to review that or adopt it as a policy? Do you know? Does anybody know?
I raised the question. I didn't hear any fuss being made by the junior, the media, or the missionaries.
I think that if the CIA chooses to go that route, I think it'll have a lot of difficulty in finding journalists who would do it. I'm not saying they aren't out there, and certainly in the past some have done it. There's no question about that. From the CIA point of view, it's a very attractive option because foreign correspondents in particular are very mobile and can in fact get into places where ordinary or where diplomats or officials cannot go. So it's obviously a worthwhile investment of their time and money, but whether they can find the journalists, I would hope they couldn't.
Would you be nervous, just because you're a journalist?
You mean in terms of it reflecting on those who are out in the field, that everybody, well, yeah. But it's not unusual. Everybody, in any totalitarian country, every journalist is regarded as a spy anyway. So it's sort of de facto reality you live with.
Let me formally thank the panel for another marvelous evening. These evenings with the Baltimore Sun are always very special, and I think, as suggested by the next to the last question, this panel was one of our, I think, most cogent and comprehensive of panels, so we're especially in your debt this evening. Thanks so much.